am Tiffany Olson, and I've been at the College of DuPage for about 10 years now. And when I originally came to the college, I worked as a Speech 1100 instructor. I was in the classroom and taught the Speech 1100 class. And several years ago, I transitioned to here in the Learning Commons, and specifically I work in writing, reading, and speech assistance. And for those of you that haven't visited Writing, Reading, Speech Assistance here in the Learning Commons, we are the academic support center here on campus. So if you need additional assistance with any course that you're taking, and specifically, like I said, I work in writing, reading, and speech assistance. So if you need any assistance in those areas, we're the place that you can come to. The reason why this workshop started is because when I was in the classroom teaching Speech 1100, we started doing an evaluation of how well our students were citing sources. That is a requirement for Speech 1100 speeches to cite your sources orally. And we noticed that students were really struggling with it. They weren't really sure how to do it. They weren't really sure why they were doing it. And so we're working in conjunction with the Speech 1100 faculty to put this workshop together to make that clear to our students. The first thing I want to talk to you about is why we even cite sources. And there are several different reasons that we cite sources. The first reason is to avoid plagiarism. If you present someone else's ideas without giving credit, that is plagiarism. And so you want to make sure that you're telling the audience where you got this information. And it's plagiarism whether it's intentional or not. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind. The second reason why we cite sources is because it fulfills the assignment requirements. For Speech 1100 and for other classes that you might give a speech in, you are required to cite your sources, to tell your audience where you got this information, and you do so orally during your presentation. If you don't do it, you're going to lose points. And so it's kind of a no-brainer. Well, then let's do it so that we don't lose any of our possible points. The third reason why we cite sources is to show our credibility. Most of the time, you're not going to be the expert on the topic that you're speaking on. Most of the time. And so, in order to establish your credibility and enhance your credibility, you want to cite the sources that are experts. Let's say I'm giving a speech on heart disease, and I say that heart disease is the leading cause of death among Americans. But who's Tiffany Olson to say anything about heart disease? So I would want to cite a cardiologist. I would want to cite someone who is credible, that's going to make my information more readily acceptable by my audience. The fourth reason is to show currency, to show recency, and make the audience understand that this is a current problem. And so when I cite a source from 2016, you understand that this problem I'm talking about is still really prevalent now and wasn't just that way 20 years ago. Things change a lot in our country and in our world, and so we want to make sure that people know this is currently an issue. And the last reason why we cite sources is because it allows for follow-up. It allows us to, allows our audience to hear the information that we're saying and I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know if that's really the truth. And then follow up on it. Go find that source and do some additional research on it. It's not like a paper where we're going to have a bibliography sheet or a reference sheet at the end of it. When you're giving an oral presentation, the audience hears it once, they hear the information, and if they want to follow up on it, they need to know where you got that information. And so that's the last reason why we cite our sources orally. Next, I want to talk about what should be cited. Because that's, I think, a struggle that a lot of students have is I don't even know what I'm supposed to cite. So the first thing that you're supposed to cite is anything that is not common knowledge. And common knowledge is knowledge that is shared by all of us, most of us. For example, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. That's common knowledge. You wouldn't need to cite that. Barack Obama is our current president. You would not need to cite that. However, you would want to cite something that is not information that we all share. Facts, figures, statistics, ideas. For example, you wouldn't need to cite that the College of DuPage is in Glen Ellen, Illinois. You would want to cite what the operating budget is for the College of DuPage, because I don't think any of us know that. Second thing you would want to cite is anything that didn't come from your brain, from your head, anything that came from someone else. And this doesn't have to be a direct quotation. It doesn't have to be a word-for-word quotation. It can be a paraphrasing of someone else's ideas. But you want to make sure that anything that didn't come from your noggin gets cited. Anything that is someone else's idea. And you're probably thinking, but isn't that the exact same thing you just said? Yes, but sometimes it's unclear what exactly I mean by anything that didn't come from your brain. So anything that is someone else's idea needs to be cited for the same reasons we talked about before. It gives more credibility. Then you're not plagiarizing. Fulfills the assignment requirements. When in doubt, cite. If you're thinking to yourself, I don't know whether this is considered someone else's idea. I don't know, maybe I had the idea at the same time. When in doubt, cite. Okay? One thing I do want to say is you should defer to your instructor on this. Different instructors have different expectations for how often you cite and what you cite. For example, when I taught Speech 1100, I required students every time they cited something that was not common knowledge, that didn't come from their brain, I wanted them to cite it. Other instructors require you to cite each of your 3 sources one time each. It really depends on what your teacher wants you to do, so defer to your instructor. I want to explain the difference between an oral citation and a written citation, because that's another area that sometimes is a little bit confusing. An oral citation is what you say orally during your presentation. A written citation, on the other hand, looks like a bibliography or a works cited or a reference page. And that you might include with your speech when you turn in your outline. But the information that is included in an oral citation versus a written citation is a little bit different. There's more information in a written citation than there is in an oral citation. Why don't students like doing source cites? This is another issue. Students a lot of times will say, I don't want to do the source citations because, and these are some of the reasons that we hear. Number one, we hear that they sound awkward. Just sounds awkward. Like, I don't normally talk like that. That's not the way people speak. You also hear it takes too much time. Your speeches are often given a 5 to 7, 6 to 8 minute time limit, and you spend a lot of your time having to cite these sources. It just takes too much time. There's too much to remember. I can't remember 3 different authors and the dates that they were and the titles, and it's just too much to remember. I don't know what to say or how much to say. I don't know what's even supposed to be included in these source citations. That's another thing that we hear a lot. And they can sound awkward, and they can take too much time, and there is a lot to remember. But I'm going to tell you a way to make it more efficient, and hopefully these comments that students give won't really be an issue after you get a little bit further instruction. So what should be included in a citation? There's 3 things: who, what, and when. Those are the 3 things that should be included in an oral source citation. Who, what, when. Who is the author and the author's credentials. What is the title of the source? Not the title of the article, not the name of the database, but the title of the magazine, Time Magazine, or the title of the book, Public Speaking and You. And when is the date of publication, the date of the interview, the date that the website was last updated or accessed. I have a handout that I passed out to each of you that creates a chart that just kind of breaks it down and makes it even more simpler. Let's say you're citing an article, a magazine article, a newspaper, a journal article. If you go to the far left column and find article on there, and then go over to the right, it will tell you the things that you need to include. The author's name and credibility, the date that the article was published, and the title of the periodical, not the article title. According to Tiffany Olson, a lead coach in writing reading speech assistants, in an October 10th, 2015 article in the Courier COD student newspaper? Okay, a couple of things. The reason I clarified the Courier COD student newspaper is because outside of the College of DuPage, a lot of people might not know what the Courier is, so you can have a little bit more explanation. You'll notice that I have the author's name, Tiffany Olson, and credibility. Because outside of this room, people are like, who's Tiffany Olson? So you need to give a little bit more information. Now you understand why Tiffany Olson is credible to talk about this topic, because she's the lead coach in writing, reading, and speech assistance. And then the date, October 10th, 2015, explains to you how recent this was. So this is really recent information, okay. So, who? Tiffany Olson, a lead coach in writing, reading, speech assistance. What? What is the title of the source? The Courier, COD student newspaper. And when? October 10th, 2015. Books. You're going to include the same information, the who, the what, the when. The title, the author's name, and credentials, and the year of publication. You do not want to include page number, or publisher, or city of publication. And those are things that are all included in the written source citation, but not in the oral source citation. In her 2015 book, Source Citations Rock, Tiffany Olson, lead coach in writing, reading, speech assistance at the College of DuPage, said, okay, so this who, what is the who in there? Tiffany Olson, lead coach, blah, blah, blah. The what? The book, Source Citations Rock. Notice that I have the word book in there. That just gives a little bit more information. One of the reasons why we include source citations is to allow for follow-up. Now you know I need to look up this book, Source Citations Rock, and 2015. Interviews. Interviews are another really good source of information for your speeches, for your papers, and it's something that a lot of times students don't think about. And the reason interviews are good is because you can ask whatever question you want to ask and get that information. You might want to know, how the population of the College of DuPage has changed over the years, and you looked and you couldn't find that information, so you could do an interview with the head of admissions and get the exact statistics that you want. What you want to include in the interview is, once again, the person's name that you interviewed, his or her credentials, and the date of the interview. You also want to say somewhere in there that this information was obtained from a personal interview. And there's multiple ways to do personal interviews. You can do an email interview, you could do a face-to-face interview, you can do a phone interview. In a personal interview with Tiffany Olson, lead coach from COD's Writing, Reading, Speech Assistance on February 10th, 2016, she told me that. Now, one of the things we talked about why students don't like to do these source citations is because they're wordy. And that is a lot of wording to say. But you only need to cite it fully like that the first time. And then subsequent times you can just say, in the interview with Tiffany Olson. Okay, you don't have to give all of this information every time. So it's going to be kind of a mouthful right at first, but you don't need to give all of that every time that you cite that interview. Web pages. Okay. So web pages is another great source of information. There's several things that you want to establish before you cite a web page, however. You want to make sure of the website's credibility. You want to make sure that you are citing a website that goes through some checks and balances, that has some credibility. The American Heart Association's website would be a good one because that's a well-established organization. Currency. How recent was this information? How recently was this information put on the website? And then objectivity. Are they looking at this issue that they're putting information out on objectively? Or do they have a bias and they're looking only at one side of it and perhaps even misleading you? So for a web page, you want to include the title of the web page. So the title of this web page is the College of DuPage. Okay? You're not going to say the URL in the oral source citation. You're not going to say www.cod.edu. You're going to say the College of DuPage's website. You want to say the author, the organization, or the sponsor. Who is responsible for this web page? Sometimes that's going to be really obvious. The College of DuPage is responsible for the College of DuPage's website. Other times it's not going to be as clear. You might need to look around a little bit on the website. Maybe you find who we are or who are we, you know, something like that in the on the main page of that website that gives you a little bit more information about who is responsible for this website. So date last updated or date last accessed, you're only going to put one date down. Date last updated tells us when did the author, organization, sponsor put this information on the website. Date last accessed is when did you last go to that website and get that information. The only reason you would include date last accessed is if there wasn't a date last updated indicator on the website. Okay, so date last updated tells us how recent is this information. Date last access just tells us when you went to your computer. It's not, date last access really doesn't give us much information. It just says that this information is on there, but it could have been added there 10 years ago. Okay. When you give the author, organization, and sponsor, you also, like we talked about with books and with articles, you also want to give a little statement of their credentials. According to the web page maintained by the Wisconsin Council of Dairy Farmers entitled Dairy Products and Your Diet, as of January 10th, 2015, yogurt, ... Okay, I've got the word web page in there. We know that this is from a website. The WHO, Wisconsin Council of Dairy Farmers, they're the organization that is responsible for this website. The what? An article from that web page called Dairy Products in Your Diet, and then the date, January 10th, 2015. Or, let's say they didn't have the date that that information was updated. I could say of an unknown date, which I accessed on September 18th, 2015. You never want to skip saying one of those who, what's, when. Who, what, or when statements. You want to make sure you say all three of them. So, you know, you don't want to just leave no date because one wasn't given. You would just say the date that you accessed it. So what if all of this information is not available? You could say something like author not stated or author not given. I want to show you this source because I want you to understand that the source information, the who, the what, the when, might not always be really readily accessible. It might not be right on the cover sheet. Okay, so the who, U.S. Department of Justice, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Okay, and that might be your who. And then the what, well, it's a study of active shooter incidents in the United States between 2000 and 2013. And then the date, it's going to be hard for you to see, but all the way down in that bottom right corner, it says September 16th, 2013. But I would really like to have a person's name on here, just something that gives it a little bit more credibility. Again, this is going to be hard for you to see, but if you go on this website, down here it says, while permission to reprint is not necessary, the citation should be Blair, J. Pete, and Schweik, Catherine W. Okay? So sometimes you might have to scroll to the next page, get a little more creative in digging for your information. There's nothing wrong with saying the Department of Justice, the FBI, but this just gives us a little bit more information, which makes it potentially more credible. If J. Pete Blair is a really well-known, researcher in this area, it just gives it a little bit more credibility. But you always want to say the who, the what, the when, even if you have to say author not given, date last accessed. Don't leave out one of those three areas. The next thing I want to talk about is the difference between print versus online versus web. And this gets a little bit confusing because a print source is this. If I read an article in the Lombardian and I am citing the article that I read in this newspaper, this is a print source. whatever format it was in when I accessed it, print, okay? Because it's a hard copy. If I actually get a book off the shelf in the library, then that is actually a print copy. And this matters when you're doing your reference page. It matters whether it was a print source or an online source or a website when you're coming up with your MLA and your APA reference page. Online is an electronic version of items that originally existed in hard copy. So I could probably go to the Lombardians webpage and get this information. But that would be considered an online source. Keep in mind, online means that it is information that originally existed in print format. Same thing like if you're doing an e-book. There is a hard copy of that book, but you accessed it online, electronically. Databases, most always, are online sources because there is a journal that exists in print format. Web sources exist in web-based format only. There is no hard copy version. And the reason why I'm talking about this distinction is because a lot of times instructors will say you can have one, and they might call it online or website source. What they mean typically, and again, defer to your instructor, but what they typically mean is that you can have one, or whatever their number is, website source. And the reason for that is print sources and online sources typically have a checks and balances. Someone who's making sure that the information that is put out there is factual, is current, is relevant, all of that. A website, I could create a website right here, right now, and put any piece of information I wanted to, factual or otherwise, and there's no one checking over to make sure that that information is correct. That's the reason we limit websites. Now, websites are still a good place for you to go and kind of do your pre-research, like Wikipedia or Google. That's still a good place to kind of do some pre-research, but when you actually cite the source in your speech, that's more than just something you consult in. That's something you actually want to quote or really delve into in your presentation. Primary sources versus secondary sources. According to an FBI study, as cited in a January 10th, 2016 Time Magazine article by Tiffany Olson, the primary source is according to an FBI study. The FBI study is the primary source. The secondary source is Tiffany Olson's article in Time Magazine. Tiffany Olson is doing a commentary or an evaluation or something on that primary source. A secondary source analyzes or interprets or retells or explains or critiques the primary resource. And the reason why that matters is because Tiffany Olson might misrepresent what was in that primary source. The primary source is going to be a stronger source. However, we're not often going to go looking for FBI studies necessarily. We might go to Time Magazine and they reference that FBI study. But the primary source is a first-hand account. So it's usually going to be a better source, but also you cite it differently. And the reason for that is if you want to go look up that information from the FBI study, you need to know, oh, you got to go to Time Magazine because that's where Tiffany Olson actually is reporting it from. I want to talk to you about the difference between quoting versus paraphrasing. Quoting is identical to the original. It's a word-for-word copy of what was in the original. and you want to make sure that you attribute that quotation to the original author. Paraphrasing is when you take what you read in that original source and you put it into your own words. A paraphrase still needs to be credited to the original author, the original person who came up with that idea. The only reason you really need to use quoting is when that person said it better than you could possibly say it yourself. Some things should not be paraphrased because they were just said so beautifully and so eloquently the first time. A lot of times, though, people have direct quotation after direct quotation after direct quotation because they don't really trust themselves to put it in their own words. But that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for your words and your thoughts. And so paraphrasing is definitely something that you should employ, but keep in mind, you still got those ideas from someplace else, and so you want to make sure that you still cite them. The library has some really great resources that will clarify some of what I said, or just it can serve as a great reference for when I'm not in front of you with this information. This right here is on the library's webpage and tells you how to cite the sources using APA or MLA. You'll notice print sources or electronic sources or multimedia sources. You need to determine first, is it a print source, is it an electronic source, and then click on that and it will tell you how to format your reference page. The librarians worked hand in hand with the Speech 1100 faculty to come up with this speech research page, which tells you about some of the research fundamentals and where you can go to find informative speech research and persuasive speech research, where there are different current topics if you're having a hard time selecting your topic for your speech. And also research fundamentals, which tells you where you can locate sources and evaluate sources. Criteria for evaluating sources. How can you tell if it's a good source or not? These are just some great resources that you can refer to that can take this a few steps further. One way for you to practice on your own is by going to this slide and taking the information that is in here and turning it into an oral source citation. Finding the who, the what, the when from here and turning that into your own oral source citation. And if you have any specific areas that we can help you in, please come visit us in the Writing, Reading, Speech Assistance area. We're part of the Learning Commons, and we're happy to work one-on-one with you if you're having a hard time on your oral source citations or your source citations in general. So, thank you.